Today, Edmund de la Pole is often regarded as little more than a footnote in history. However, for more than 25 years, he was the highest-ranking representative of the House of York, a position that made him a significant figure during the early Tudor period. His importance was such that Henry VII, the first Tudor king, refused to release a captive king unless Edmund was handed over to him. This influence extended to Henry's son, Henry VIII, who, despite a promise allegedly made by his father, began his notorious series of executions with Edmund. Another key figure of the era, Sir James Tyrrell, was also involved. He confessed, according to Thomas More, to the murder of the princes in the Tower before his own execution. It is possible that Henry VII devised a clever scheme during his lifetime to finally capture the fugitive de la Pole. Today, we turn our attention to a man whose story encapsulates the transition from the Wars of the Roses to the establishment of Tudor rule. Yet despite his significance, Edmund de la Pole remains largely forgotten, a fate that had already begun during his lifetime. Edmund de la Pole was the second eldest son of John de la Pole and Elizabeth of York. However, this name can be misleading, so I prefer to refer to her as Elizabeth of Suffolk. She was not the wife of Henry VII, but a daughter of Richard of York, making her the sister of Edward IV and Richard III. As a result, Edmund was the cousin of the princes in the Tower, Queen Elizabeth of York, Richard III's son, Edward of Middleham, and Edward Plantagenet. Originally, Edmund would likely never have been considered a serious contender for the throne, as many male York heirs preceded him in the line of succession. However, this changed with the disappearance of the princes in the Tower, the exclusion of Edward Plantagenet from the succession and his subsequent imprisonment in the Tower, the early death of Richard III's son, and the fatal defeat of the last York king at the Battle of Bosworth. Suddenly, Edmund was thrust into second place in the line of succession, with only his older brother John ahead of him. Allegedly, Richard III had named John his heir, indicating that Elizabeth's sons were recognized despite the absence of a consistent male line from Richard of York. Initially, John, Edmund, and their other siblings were loyal to Henry VII. However, this changed as early as 1487, when the first pretender, Lambert Simnel, challenged King Henry, and John joined his cause. John died at the Battle of Stoke, placing the family in great peril. Richard III had granted John the property and pension of Margaret Beaufort. Edmund, who had been made a Knight of the Bath during the celebrations for Richard III's coronation, was now under suspicion. The Tudors likely did not regard the de la Pole as entirely trustworthy. Despite this, Edmund remained loyal to the Tudor monarch. He fought for Henry during the invasion of France in 1492 and was present at the Siege of Boulogne in October. Edmund's father had died in May of that year, and Henry initially allowed Edmund to bear the paternal title of Duke of Suffolk. However, just 1 year later, Edmund was forced to renounce the duchy by treaty and was demoted to Earl of Suffolk. Parliament ratified this decision 2 years later, providing Henry's treasury with a substantial influx of £5,000. For this sum, Edmund received part of the land confiscated from his brother John. The law's text suggests that this was a generous gesture, stating that the decision was made in consideration of the true and diligent service done to His Highness by the said Edmund. In reality, it was more of a penalty, as the land's value did not equal the £5,000. This raises the inevitable question of why Henry first awarded Edmund the paternal title, fought alongside him, and then demoted him. Something must have happened between the two men, but the details remain unknown. Some theories involve Perkin Warbeck, who was active at that time. However, in 1497, Edmund fought as one of Henry's commanders against the Cornish rebels at Blackheath on June 17th, indirectly undermining Warbeck's cause, which sought to exploit the uprising. Up until this point, the sources depict Edmund as a loyal servant of the Tudor king. Privately, Edmund's situation seemed stable as well. He had married Margaret, daughter of Sir Richard Scrope, and the couple had a daughter, Elizabeth, who later became a nun. Tragically, she died of the Black Death in 1515, the same year that Edmund's wife also passed away. In 1498, Edmund de la Pole became embroiled in his first scandal, an event recorded by the Tudor historian Polydore Virgil. Virgil characterized de la Pole as bold, brave, and headstrong, a description that suggests the historian was sympathetic toward him. According to Virgil, de la Pole was guilty of homicide because he killed a low-born man in a quarrel, and although the king spared him, he took it amiss that he was required to stand his trial as an accused man, for this is a mark of disgrace. As a result, Edmund fled England, seeking refuge at the palace of Margaret of York, where Perkin Warbeck had previously found shelter. The details of what happened next are not entirely clear. According to Virgil, Edmund so excused his deed to Henry that he seemed to be free of guilt. Consequently, he was able to return to England without facing punishment, evidently receiving a royal pardon. Whether this pardon was granted because Henry genuinely believed in Edmund's innocence or simply wished to avoid a repeat of the Warbeck affair remains uncertain. Some sources suggest that Henry sent Sir Richard Gill after July 1, 1499, to persuade Edmund to return. Regardless of the underlying reasons, Edmund was once again present at the royal court by September 1499. Edmund de la Pole seemed to have been fully restored to royal favor. He was, after all, one of the witnesses to the marriage contract between Prince Arthur and the Spanish Infanta Catherine of Aragon, finalized on May 5, 1500. Ironically, it is said that this event motivated Edmund to finally break with the Tudor king. Polydore Virgil provides an account of Edmund's actions during this period. And so while the marriage of Arthur and Catherine was being celebrated at London and all the people were given over to pleasure, and while Henry in particular was relishing his happiness, he went back to Flanders with his brother Richard, either because he was oppressed by debt, he had contracted a lot for that marriage, or was solicited by his aunt, or again, because he was provoked by envy, not being able to stand the sight of Henry, a man of the opposing faction, reigning for so many years. I believe this regrettable thing happened amidst the general rejoicing, so Henry would not immediately die for pure happiness, which is recorded to have happened on other occasions. Virgil himself seemed puzzled by Edmund's sudden flight, attributing it to envy, though he fails to mention that Edmund actually fled in August 1501, months before the wedding, which took place on November 14th. Catherine of Aragon did not even arrive in England until October 2nd, 1501. Historian Alison Hannam offers an alternative explanation, suggesting that Edmund's discontent stemmed from his diminished status after being relegated to Earl, especially since he began calling himself Duke of Suffolk again after his second escape. With only one royal duke in the country, Edward Stafford, the third Duke of Buckingham, Edmund, a son of Elizabeth of Suffolk, and closer to the throne than Buckingham, may have been driven by anger over his reduced standing. Regardless of the true motive, Edmund's escape seemed impulsive, spurred by a vague promise of support from Maximilian. He fled with only his brother Richard, leaving their other brother William imprisoned in the Tower, where he would remain for the rest of his life. Edmund's escape was facilitated by Sir James Tyrrell, who had helped him during his first escape and was then a captain in Guienne. The two had become friends, and Tyrrell's assistance in this second escape would ultimately cost him his life. Edmund and Richard travelled to present-day Germany, seeking Maximilian's help. However, this assistance never materialised. Instead, Henry VII had already begun negotiations with Maximilian, who agreed to cease aiding English rebels in exchange for £10,000. This agreement, known as the Treaty of Augsburg, was signed on July 28, 1502. On December 26 of that year, Edmund and his brothers were publicly declared lawless rebels in Ipswich, allowing the king to take action against any of their English supporters, though there were few left. Only Edmund's steward, Thomas Killingworth, a lawyer from East Anglia, remained loyal. Following his public ostracism, Edmund's debts continued to mount. In 1504, more bad news arrived from England. Parliament had sentenced Edmund and Richard to death in absentia as traitors. This only worsened Edmund's situation, as anyone aiding him from that point forward would also be considered a traitor. In desperation, Edmund sought help from foreign princes, but the King of France and the Archduke of Burgundy refused him. Forced to leave his brother Richard in Germany as collateral for his debts, Edmund attempted to travel to Friesland in northwestern Germany in April 1504 to seek support from the Duke of Saxony. Before he could reach his destination, however, he was captured by the Duke of Guelders and imprisoned in Hatton Castle in July 1504. At first, it seemed that the problem would resolve quickly. On July 28, 1505, Archduke Philip of Burgundy captured the castle where Edmund de la Pole was held, due to his ongoing feud with the Duke of Guelders. However, in August, Philip returned the politically sensitive prisoner to his captor. Edmund soon attempted an escape, but was recaptured after only a mile. During his time as an unwilling guest of Charles of Egmont, Edmund's character became increasingly apparent. In his letters, he insisted that his situation was not his own fault, placing the blame on George Neville. This fellow exile had convinced him to abandon Maximilian and head to Friesland. When his brother and servants pleaded for financial support, Edmund decided to dismiss his staff, except for the loyal Killingworth. He instructed Killingworth to cease all efforts to assist Richard de la Pole. He attempted to relocate to Hungary, but Edmund dismissed the idea as he still had plans for his brother. Meanwhile, de la Pole's servant William Long was imprisoned in Zwolle for 14 days because Edmund failed to pay his debts. Even Killingworth's loyalty began to waver. He urged Edmund to answer his letters personally rather than delegating every task to him. Their relationship deteriorated. Eventually, Edmund was handed over to Philip of Burgundy and imprisoned in Namur. Under the supervision of Lord Chivre, Edmund was granted a pension of 20 guilders per month, a sum far below his expectations. Despite this, he repeatedly complained to Killingworth about not receiving the items he had requested, even accusing his servant of embezzling funds. "Where becomes all t'other money?" he wrote in a letter to Killingworth. Edmund himself remained optimistic. Since his captivity under the Duke of Guelders, he had been regularly visited by a man he referred to as Father in his letters, someone who seemed to be communicating with the knowledge of Henry VII. The discussions between Edmund and this Father intensified at the end of December 1505, when rumours circulated in Antwerp that Philip and Maximilian were negotiating peace with the English king, a peace that might include Edmund's extradition to England, likely without his consent. Faced with this possibility, Edmund felt pressured to negotiate directly with Henry. The Father assured him of the English king's favour and arranged for him to contact Henry's servant, John Chamberlain. Killingworth was tasked with delivering Edmund's proposals for reconciliation, and Chamberlain further reinforced the idea of Henry's generosity toward Edmund. By January 28, 1506, Edmund had written down all his terms and sent Killingworth to present them. In a letter to another recipient on the same day, Edmund mentioned that good news should be expected from him within 15 days. However, the conditions he set for his submission to Henry were far removed from reality. He demanded recognition as Duke of Suffolk, the return of all family property, and substantial financial endowment. Henry, however, had no intention of meeting any of these demands. Chamberlain was one of his spies, and the father who visited Edmund was likely a spy as well. Their purpose was to persuade the fugitive to return to England, where he could be imprisoned and the sentence against him could be carried out. It remains unclear whether Edmund's list of demands ever reached the Tudor king. Fate, however, had other plans. Joanna of Castile had inherited her mother's crown, and her husband Philip was poised to become king. The couple set off to claim this vital inheritance, but strong winds forced their ship off course, leading to a shipwreck on the English coast. For 6 weeks, they were the involuntary guests of Henry VII and his mother, Margaret Beaufort. To secure their release, Henry VII made several demands: a new trade treaty with Burgundy that would heavily favour England, a marriage alliance with Philip's sister Margaret, and crucially, the extradition of Edmund de la Pole. In Burgundy, this treaty became known as the Malus Intercursus, or Evil Treaty, in stark contrast to the previous Intercursus Magnus, meaning Great Treaty. Philip had no choice but to comply. The Chronicle of Calais records that Henry had to swear an oath to let Edmund live, and since Edmund returned to London on March 16, 1506, heavily guarded and soon imprisoned in the Tower, this account seems credible. For both Philip and Henry, however, the treaty proved costly. Philip died later in 1506, leaving his wife Joanna, Catherine of Aragon's sister, to survive him by 48 years. History would remember her as Joanna la Loca, or Joanna the Mad. In Burgundy, Philip was succeeded by Margaret, who had no desire to marry Henry and refused to sign the Malus Intercursus, effectively nullifying the agreement. This raises the question of whether Henry's vow to let Edmund live was also rendered void. It is said that the first Tudor king regretted not having Edmund de la Pole executed. Michel de Montaigne, writing several decades later, noted in one of his essays that Henry VII instructed his son in his will to execute de la Pole immediately after his death. However, upon his accession to the throne, Henry VIII did not go that far. Still, Edmund's name was among the 77 individuals specifically exempted from the general pardon issued by the new king. In 1512, as Henry VIII prepared for war with France, the French crown offered support to Edmund's brother, Richard, who was residing in France. Pietro Martire d'Angera, an Italian scholar and contemporary of Edmund who spent much of his life in Spain, wrote that Edmund had secretly written to his brother, urging him to invade England. This letter, however, was intercepted by Henry's officers, sealing Edmund's fate. Whatever the true circumstances, Henry VIII ordered a secret execution, which took place on April 30th, 1513. There was no new trial. Instead, the Crown cited the 1504 parliamentary attainder as justification. Edmund was removed from his cell, taken to Tower Hill, and beheaded, a deliberate humiliation as he was denied the dignity of an execution within the Tower, which would have been customary for someone of his royal lineage. Following Edmund's death, Henry re-awarded the title of Duke of Suffolk to his close friend, Charles Brandon. Edmund's execution did not provoke any outcry. By that time, Europe's princes had long since lost interest in him. His debts were overwhelming, and his support in England was minimal. His boastful, narcissistic, and often presumptuous behavior, combined with a certain naivety, contributed to his downfall. For instance, Edmund once attempted to escape using the help of the father figure who had previously visited him, but the plan failed. It is likely that Edmund never fully understood how his life had unraveled so disastrously. My members can find this script with an expanded bibliography in the channel's community tab. Thanks for watching. Please help Edmund de la Pole escape by liking and subscribing